Everyone knew what this was supposed to be before it even started. The moment the show was announced, the story had already been written in the public's mind. A comedian had told a joke, people online were angry, a so-called woke activist was invited onto live television to explain why that joke was harmful. The comedian was invited too, but not to defend himself, only to sit there and take responsibility. From the very beginning, the situation felt unfair. Not because jokes can't be criticized, but because the outcome seemed decided before anyone spoke. The audience wasn't tuning in to hear both sides. They were tuning in to watch someone get publicly corrected, embarrassed, and possibly erased. The show itself was a popular daytime talk show. Bright lights, a cheerful host, a clapping audience. The kind of place where serious topics are discussed in friendly tones, but always with a clear moral direction. When the host opened the segment, she spoke slowly and carefully, using words that sounded reasonable on the surface. She talked about how comedy is powerful, how words matter, and how society is learning to be more compassionate. None of it sounded extreme. In fact, it all sounded obvious. That was the point. By the time she finished her introduction, the audience already knew who the good guy was supposed to be and who the bad guy was. The activist was introduced first. The host listed their titles and achievements: organizer, advocate, speaker, someone who holds people accountable. The audience applauded loudly. The activist smiled, nodded, and waited patiently. They looked calm, confident, and completely at home. Then the comedian was introduced. His career was mentioned quickly. A stand-up comedian, a podcaster, someone known for controversial humor. The applause this time was quieter. Some people clapped, others didn't. The imbalance was obvious. Before the conversation even began, one person had the moral high ground and the other was already climbing uphill. The host turned to the activist and invited them to explain why the joke was harmful. The activist didn't hesitate. They spoke clearly, confidently, and without anger. They explained that the joke reinforced stereotypes, that it made marginalized people feel unsafe, that comedy doesn't exist in a vacuum, that when someone with a platform jokes about sensitive topics, it sends a message whether they intend it or not. The activist emphasized that they weren't trying to cancel anyone, they just wanted accountability. That word came up again and again, accountability. It sounded reasonable. Who could argue against accountability? The audience nodded along. Some people clapped softly as the activist spoke. The host smiled approvingly. The activist continued saying that this kind of humor belonged to the past, that society had evolved, that comedians needed to evolve too. They spoke about harm, responsibility, and progress. They spoke like someone who had given this speech many times before. Every sentence landed exactly where it was supposed to. The framing was clear. The comedian wasn't just wrong, he was behind, outdated, a problem that needed to be addressed. When it was finally the comedian's turn to speak, the host framed the question carefully. She asked how he felt knowing that his joke had hurt people. She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't ask why he told it. She asked how he felt knowing the harm he caused. The question itself assumed guilt. The comedian could either apologize or look heartless. It was a trap disguised as compassion. The comedian paused for a moment before answering. He didn't look angry. He didn't roll his eyes. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said that he never intended to hurt anyone, that he told a joke, that comedy by nature exaggerates and pokes at uncomfortable things. The activist immediately shook his head. The host gently interrupted. "Intent doesn't matter," she said. "Impact matters." The audience applauded again. The comedian hadn't even finished his sentence. This is where the sense of injustice really started to sink in. Every time the comedian tried to explain himself, he was cut off. When he spoke calmly, he was told he was minimizing harm. When he tried to add context, he was told context didn't excuse impact. The activist, meanwhile, was allowed to speak freely. They explained that jokes like his create real-world consequences, that laughter can normalize cruelty, that silence in the face of harm is violence. The language became stronger.
the accusations heavier. The audience began reacting more emotionally. Some people clapped loudly after every point the activist made. Others laughed dismissively when the comedian spoke. The imbalance wasn't just in time or framing, it was emotional. The room was against him. Watching from home, it felt uncomfortable, not because the activist was criticizing the joke, but because the comedian wasn't being allowed to actually speak. The conversation wasn't a conversation, it was a performance of moral superiority. At one point, the activist said comedians like him should lose platforms if they refuse to change. They said free speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences. The hosts nodded. The audience applauded. The comedian smiled slightly, not sarcastically, but calmly. He waited until the applause died down. Then he asked a simple question. He asked who gets to decide which jokes are allowed and which ones aren't. The room shifted slightly. It wasn't dramatic yet, but something changed. The activist answered quickly, saying society decides, that communities decide, that people affected by harm decide. The comedian nodded and asked another question. How do you measure harm from a joke? Is it based on how many people complain, how loud they are, how much power they have online? The activist hesitated for a moment. They said harm is real even if it's hard to measure. The comedian agreed, harm is real, but then he asked if offense and harm are the same thing. The activist said they often are. The comedian didn't argue. He simply asked if being offended automatically means someone else did something wrong. The room grew quieter. The host leaned forward. The activist tried to respond, saying offense reflects deeper issues. The comedian nodded and said something that changed the tone of the entire segment. He said that comedy isn't about comfort. It never has been. Comedy has always challenged norms, exposed hypocrisy, and made people laugh at things they weren't supposed to laugh at. He said that if comedy's job is to never offend anyone, then comedy stops existing. The activist pushed back, saying that's a false choice, that comedians can be funny without harming people. The comedian agreed again. He said many comedians do exactly that. But then he asked why this joke, out of millions told every year, was singled out, why this moment required a public shaming, why this conversation wasn't happening in good faith but as a warning. The activist denied that it was about shaming. They said it was about growth. Then the comedian calmly explained the context of the joke. He explained who it was aimed at. He explained the point he was making. He explained how the clip being criticized was 30 seconds pulled from a longer routine. He explained how audiences at his shows, including people from the very groups being discussed, laughed because they understood the point. The host tried to interrupt again, but the comedian kept speaking, not louder, just steadier. For the first time, the audience wasn't clapping, they were listening. Then he asked the activist if they had watched the full routine. The activist said they had seen the clip. The comedian asked again if they had watched the full routine. The activist admitted they hadn't. The room went quiet. It wasn't a dramatic silence, but it was noticeable. The comedian didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply asked how someone could confidently accuse him of harm without seeing the full context. The activist tried to recover by saying context doesn't erase harm. The comedian agreed once more. Context doesn't erase harm. But he asked if context matters at all. If it doesn't, then why bother discussing intent, nuance, or meaning? Why not just judge everything by how it feels in a moment? He pointed out that this kind of thinking gives enormous power to the most offended voices, not the most thoughtful ones. The host attempted to steer the conversation back, but it was too late. The reversal had already happened. The person who came in as the moral authority now looked unprepared. The person who came in to be shamed now looked reasonable, calm, thoughtful, human. In the final moments, the host asked the comedian if he would change his comedy. He said he would always listen, always think, always try to be better. But he said he would never accept a world where jokes are treated as crimes and disagreement is treated as harm. He said comedy needs freedom, not permission. The segment ended. The applause was mixed, but real. Online, the clip spread quickly, not because the activist won, but because something unexpected happened. The audience watching at home felt the injustice at the beginning. They felt the imbalance. They felt the framing unfair. And then they felt the correction, the calm dismantling of a narrative built on emotion rather than reason. At the end, it wasn't about politics. It wasn't even about comedy. It was about fairness, about whether conversations are meant to be honest or performative, about whether truth can still break through when the system is stacked against it. And for once, on live television, it did.